In the winter of 1944, the forests of the Ardennes lay silent beneath a heavy coat of snow. The air was still, the trees skeletal and white, and the small villages that dotted the Belgian countryside seemed frozen in time. Their narrow roads lined with abandoned carts, frost-covered fences, and the faint trails of soldiers' boots disappearing into the fog. It was a cold unlike any other, bitter, unrelenting, and merciless, the kind of cold that bites into the skin and seeps into the soul. And yet, amid that stillness, beneath that white silence, an army was moving. Germany, wounded, cornered, and desperate, was about to strike back. 6 months earlier, the tide of World War II had shifted. The Allies, after years of brutal fighting, had landed in Normandy in June 1944. Operation Overlord, D-Day, had torn open the gates of Fortress Europe. From the beaches of northern France, Allied forces pushed inland, liberating Paris in August and driving German troops eastward toward their homeland. By autumn, many believed the war in Europe was nearly over. American and British soldiers advanced across France, their commanders predicting they'd be home by Christmas. But far from the front lines, in a bunker deep within Germany, Adolf Hitler was making plans of his own. The Führer's empire was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing from the east, reclaiming vast stretches of Poland. In the west, Allied troops stood at Germany's doorstep. Berlin's once proud military machine was fractured, short on fuel, ammunition, and manpower. But Hitler, isolated and paranoid, refused to surrender. Instead, he chose one final gamble, a strike so bold, so unexpected, that it could split the Allied armies apart and perhaps, in his mind, turn defeat into victory. His plan: an all-out assault through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany had used in 1940 to crush France. The Ardennes was a region of dense woods, rolling hills and narrow roads, stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. It was considered a quiet sector, a place where battle-weary American units could rest and regroup. That very belief, that it was safe, was what Hitler intended to exploit. He called his operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The goal was daring: punch through the Allied front, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the German advance would split the British and American armies, trap tens of thousands of soldiers, and force the Allies to negotiate a peace on Germany's terms. But behind that bold ambition lay a grim reality. Germany no longer had the strength it once did. Its air force was crippled, its factories were shattered by Allied bombing, and its soldiers, many barely out of their teens, were exhausted. Yet Hitler believed that a sudden strike, launched under the cover of bad weather, could catch the Allies off guard. And so, in December 1944, more than 250,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and artillery pieces, gathered in the forests of the Ardennes. They were ordered to maintain total silence. No radios, no fires, no movement in daylight. Even German civilians in nearby villages were forbidden to leave their homes. The offensive would begin before dawn, on December 16th, 1944. Meanwhile, the Americans holding the Ardennes front had little reason to expect an attack. Many of them were fresh replacements, young, inexperienced, and spread thin across a 90-mile line. To them, this was a quiet sector. The kind of post where soldiers wrote letters home, tended fires, and waited for Christmas. In towns like Saint-Vith, Bastogne, and Malmedy, GIs drank coffee, repaired vehicles, and traded stories of what they'd do after the war. Snow fell constantly, blanketing the countryside, muffling every sound, until the morning when silence shattered. At 5:30 a.m., the dark horizon erupted in fire. Thousands of German artillery guns roared at once, their shells streaking through the fog, tearing through forests, villages, and American lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Across the front, stunned American troops scrambled from their foxholes. Communications were in chaos. Many units didn't know the scale of what was happening. Some thought it was just a local attack. But within hours, the truth became clear. The Germans weren't retreating. They were coming back with a vengeance. Panzer divisions, including the feared SS Panzer units, stormed forward through the snow. Their tanks, Tiger IIs and Panthers, thundered down the narrow roads, their black crosses barely visible in the swirling snow. Villages fell quickly. American units were overrun, surrounded, or cut off entirely. In some places, German soldiers disguised in US uniforms, led by Otto Skorzeny, infiltrated Allied lines, changing road signs, spreading confusion, and sabotaging supply routes. Everywhere, the fog of war thickened. By December 17th, the situation was dire. In the north, near the town of Malmedy, an American convoy surrendered to German SS troops. Moments later, they were lined up in a field and machine-gunned. More than 80 men executed. The Malmedy massacre became one of the most infamous atrocities of the war, fueling American determination to fight back at any cost. But despite the chaos, not all was lost. In several key towns, American units refused to yield. Small groups of soldiers, outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off, fought stubbornly to delay the German advance. Every hour they held out bought precious time for reinforcements to move in. The most critical of these strongholds was Bastogne, a crossroads town in southern Belgium. 7 major roads met there, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. When the German offensive began, the 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, was rushed to Bastogne to hold the line. They arrived with little winter clothing, limited ammunition, and no promise of air support. The weather was too bad for Allied planes to fly. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. German troops had encircled the town completely, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. Inside, American soldiers dug into the frozen ground, enduring constant shelling and bitter cold. Temperatures dropped below zero. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men froze in their makeshift shelters. Yet the defenders held firm. On December 22nd, German officers approached Bastogne under a white flag, delivering a written demand for surrender. It read, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, there is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. If this proposal is rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2-hour term." The response came from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. His answer was a single word: nuts. The message was delivered to the Germans, who, confused, asked what it meant. The American officer replied, "It means go to hell." That simple defiance became a symbol of American resilience. As the siege of Bastogne raged, the skies finally began to clear. By Christmas Eve, the weather improved enough for Allied aircraft to return to the fight. C-47s dropped food, ammunition, and medical supplies into Bastogne, while fighter planes strafed German columns and supply routes. And from the south, a massive relief force was on the way, led by General George S. Patton. Patton, commanding the US Third Army, had been pushing east toward the Saar River when news of the German offensive reached him. Within hours, he made a bold decision. to pivot his entire army north toward Bastogne, covering over 100 miles in freezing conditions. It was one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. On December 26th, Patton's lead elements broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Exhausted soldiers embraced in the snow, cheering as the long-awaited convoy rolled in. But the battle was far from over. The German offensive had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, stretching 50 miles deep and 80 miles wide. And though Bastogne was saved, fierce fighting continued across the Ardennes for weeks. By the end of December, the German advance had stalled. Their fuel reserves were nearly gone. Tanks were abandoned on the roadside, frozen in the snow. Allied air superiority, now restored, tore apart supply lines and columns. Hitler's gamble had failed. As January 1945 began, the Allies counterattacked, pushing the Germans back toward their original positions. What had begun as a desperate surprise offensive ended as a crushing defeat. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. More than 600,000 American troops took part. Casualties were staggering. Over 75,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. German losses exceeded 100,000. The frozen forests of the Ardennes were littered with the wreckage of war. Tanks half buried in snow, villages reduced to rubble, and soldiers' helmets scattered like silent reminders of the cost of ambition. When it was over, Hitler's last hope of victory in the West was gone. His forces had spent their final reserves: men, fuel, and faith. Within months, Allied troops would cross the Rhine, the Soviets would reach Berlin, and the war in Europe would end. But for those who fought in that brutal winter, the memory of the Ardennes would never fade. The cold, the fear, the courage, all of it frozen in time. And in that silence, amid the snow and the ruins, the world learned once again that freedom is never free. The thunder of artillery faded, replaced by the howling of the wind. Smoke and fog hung over the forests like a veil, and beneath it, the men who fought in the Ardennes faced an enemy as merciless as any army. The winter itself, for days, the temperature hovered below freezing. Snow drifted into foxholes, weapons jammed from ice, food was scarce, and frostbite was rampant. Men huddled together for warmth, wrapping their feet in rags, burning scraps of wood, and praying that the sun might rise. But the skies remained grey, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. The battle was not just a clash of armies. It was a test of endurance, a struggle of will between two exhausted forces trapped in a frozen nightmare. By mid-December, chaos reigned behind Allied lines. The German breakthrough had created panic. Roads were jammed with convoys of refugees, retreating units, and supply trucks moving in every direction. Rumors spread like wildfire. Stories of German paratroopers dropping behind the lines, of enemy soldiers disguised as Americans changing road signs and sowing confusion. Some of those rumors were true. Hitler had authorized a secret mission called Operation Greif, led by SS Commando Otto Skorzeny. His men, fluent in English and wearing captured American uniforms, infiltrated Allied territory in stolen jeeps. They misdirected traffic, cut communication lines, and even attempted to assassinate high-ranking officers. Soon, suspicion spread among American troops. At every checkpoint, soldiers demanded to know who played baseball for the Yankees, or who the vice president was, desperate to catch imposters. Trust began to fray. Paranoia became as dangerous as the enemy. For the men on the front, however, there was no time for rumors. Their world was defined by survival and by the grim reality of holding the line. In the north, near the small Belgian towns of Elsenborn and Monschau, the German advance met its first real resistance. American units of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions dug in on the snowy ridges. Though outnumbered, they fought with ferocious determination, halting the German 6th Panzer Army, one of Hitler's elite formations. The battle for Elsenborn Ridge was brutal. German tanks churned through the snow, their treads slipping on ice, while artillery shells tore through the frozen ground. But the Americans held firm. Their stubborn defense prevented the Germans from capturing vital northern roads that led to the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. Every hour the ridge was held, Hitler's timetable fell further behind. To the south, the story was much the same. In the region around St. Vith, American units fought desperate delaying actions. The town was a crucial road hub, one the Germans needed to reach Bastogne and beyond. For 5 days, US forces held St. Vith under relentless attack, withdrawing only when they risked being encircled. Their stand cost the Germans precious time that would later prove decisive. The German commanders, men like Sepp Dietrich, Hasso von Manteuffel, and Erich Brandenberger, realized that the offensive was faltering. The terrain was worse than expected, the roads clogged with snow and wreckage, and the fuel situation catastrophic. Every mile deeper into Belgium drained their supplies further. Hitler had gambled everything on speed and surprise, but now both were slipping away. Yet even as the German advance slowed, the fighting grew more savage. Small villages became fortresses. Names like La Glaise, Uffalise, and Foy turned into killing grounds where men fought house to house, yard to yard. In those frozen streets, soldiers experienced a kind of warfare stripped to its essence. No grand strategy, no sweeping maneuvers, just survival. Rifles froze in their hands, boots cracked from the cold, and faces turned ghostly pale from frostbite. Some men never fired a shot. They died quietly in their foxholes, overcome by exhaustion and the elements. The cold was everywhere, creeping into every bone and every breath. In Bastogne, the siege tightened. German artillery pounded the town day and night. Buildings collapsed, turning into piles of splintered wood and brick. Medics worked by candlelight, using kitchen tables as operating surfaces. The wounded groaned in cellars, wrapped in blankets, listening to the shells explode above. Still, the defenders held. General McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," had echoed far beyond Bastogne. It had become a rallying cry across the front, a symbol of defiance that lifted morale even in the darkest hours. Radio broadcasts spread the story. To the men freezing in the snow, that simple word meant something more than courage. It meant that no matter how bad things got, surrender was not an option. By Christmas Eve, the world held its breath. In Berlin, Hitler still believed his plan might succeed. He awaited reports of Antwerp's capture, reports that would never come. In the Ardennes, the reality was far different. German tanks were running out of fuel. Their supply lines stretched thin, harassed by Allied aircraft whenever the weather cleared. And the Allies were regrouping fast. Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had recognized the scale of the crisis. He ordered reinforcements from every available sector. From the north came British units under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. From the south, Patton's Third Army was racing toward Bastogne. What had begun as a German surprise was now turning into a test of Allied coordination and resolve. The turning point came on December 23rd, when the weather finally broke. The skies, grey for nearly a week, cleared suddenly. Sunlight glimmered on the snow, and the roar of engines filled the air as Allied aircraft took flight. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs streaked across the sky, strafing German columns. Bombers pounded bridges, fuel depots, and roads. For the first time since the offensive began, the Allies controlled the air again, and the effect was devastating. Convoys that had moved freely under the cover of fog were now torn apart. German troops could no longer advance or retreat easily. The element of surprise, so crucial to Hitler's plan, had vanished. Meanwhile, Patton's forces pushed through snow and ice, their tanks crawling north in freezing rain. Every mile was a battle. Roads were slick, visibility poor, and the terrain unforgiving. But Patton, relentless, brash, and determined, drove his men forward. His staff had once joked that he could turn an army on a dime, and in December 1944 he did just that. In less than 48 hours, Patton had pivoted his entire Third Army 90 degrees and launched a counterattack toward Bastogne. To do it, he had to rely on every ounce of his soldiers' endurance and on faith. On December 22nd, as snow fell thick over Luxembourg, Patton gathered his chaplain and said, "I want a prayer for good weather so we can kill the Germans." The next day, the skies cleared. Inside Bastogne, that change in weather felt like a miracle. Parachutes blossomed over the town, white, green, and orange against the blue sky, carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Wounded men cheered. For the first time in days, hope returned. And then, on December 26th, the rumble of engines echoed through the snow. American tanks appeared on the southern road, the spearhead of Patton's relief column. Bastogne was no longer surrounded. The German attack had lost momentum, but the battle itself was far from over. Fighting raged through the end of December and into January. Villages changed hands multiple times. Every hill, every bridge, every stretch of forest was contested. Even as the Allies counterattacked, the weather turned cruel again. Snowstorms buried the roads. Vehicles froze in place. Many soldiers began to feel as though the world had narrowed to a single white wilderness, endless, cold, and haunted by the echoes of artillery. But they kept fighting. For the Germans, the failure to take Bastogne was the beginning of the end. Without control of the town, their armor could not move freely. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Some tank crews resorted to siphoning gasoline from destroyed vehicles or even horse-drawn wagons. Hitler refused to accept reality. From his headquarters, he demanded continued attacks, insisting victory was still possible. His generals knew better, but few dared to speak openly. By early January, the truth was clear. The offensive had failed. And yet, the human cost continued to climb. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded across the Ardennes. Civilians, caught between armies, fled from burning homes. Entire villages disappeared beneath the snow, their names etched only in soldiers' memories. For the men who fought there, it was a landscape of ghosts. The forest was filled with shattered trees, blackened by shell fire. The once white snow had turned grey with ash and blood. To walk through it was to walk through the wreckage of a dream, Hitler's last, desperate dream of victory. The new year of 1945 dawned cold and grey over the Ardennes. The snow was deeper now, the forests quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. But beneath that silence, the rumble of engines returned, this time moving west to east. The Allies were coming back. After weeks of desperate fighting, the German offensive had spent its fury. The bulge in the Allied line, that jagged dent carved by Hitler's gamble, had begun to flatten. Now it was the Germans' turn to defend, to retreat, and to pay the price of their ambition. In late December, Allied commanders met to plan the counterattack. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm but firm, surveyed the map spread before him, thick black lines marking the front, arrows showing the direction of German thrusts. Around him stood men whose names would become legend: Patton, Montgomery, Bradley, Hodges. Each came from a different school of command: Montgomery deliberate and cautious, Patton audacious and relentless. But all shared a common goal: destroy the enemy that had dared to strike back. Hitler's offensive had drawn blood, but it had also exposed weakness. The German army was stretched thin, its fuel nearly gone, its soldiers exhausted. The time had come to strike back and finish the job. On January 1st, 1945, as Allied forces prepared to counterattack, Hitler made one last desperate move. At dawn, the skies over Western Europe filled with the roar of engines. Hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft taking off in a massive operation called Bodenplatte. It was a surprise assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, intended to cripple Allied air power. At first it worked. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Hangars burned, runways cratered, but the cost was catastrophic. Most of Germany's remaining fighter pilots, men with years of experience, were shot down that day. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 300 planes and hundreds of irreplaceable airmen. It was a final gasp from an air force already on its knees. From that day forward, the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. As Allied bombers returned to the air, the roads beneath them became graveyards of steel. German tanks, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now targets. Blackened wrecks scattered along snowy roads. Supply trucks burned. Columns of infantry trudged through the slush, harried by machine guns and rockets from above. In the north, Montgomery's British forces closed in from one side. In the south, Patton's Third Army pressed from the other. Between them lay the remnants of Hitler's once proud divisions, trapped in the shrinking Bulge. The fighting was savage. In the forest near Houffalize and La Roche, the Germans fought tenaciously, retreating yard by yard, clinging to every ridge and crossroad. But without fuel and air cover, their fate was sealed. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, weary but unbroken, pushed outward from their shattered town. They had endured one of the hardest sieges of the war: frostbite, hunger, shellfire, and fear. Yet now they were advancing, reclaiming the same ground over which the Germans had come. For many of those young soldiers, the transformation was surreal. Just days before, they'd been trapped and surrounded. Now they were chasing an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. The men who had stared death in the face during those long nights of December found new strength in the dawn of January. By January 8th, the German front began to collapse. Their once bold advance was reduced to a slow, bloody withdrawal. Hitler had demanded that his armies hold every inch of captured ground. But the reality on the battlefield made that impossible. Fuel convoys never arrived. Bridges were destroyed. Entire divisions were cut off, forced to abandon their vehicles and march through snow on foot. The dream of splitting the Allied armies had become a nightmare of retreat. For the soldiers of both sides, the Ardennes had become a frozen hell. In those final days of the battle, conditions were almost beyond imagination. Snowdrifts reached waist height. The wind sliced through heavy coats. Weapons malfunctioned constantly. Rifle bolts freezing solid. Machine guns refusing to fire. Men burned whatever they could find for warmth. Crates, fences, even furniture from ruined homes. The wounded often couldn't be evacuated in time. Medics worked in icy barns, their breath visible in the cold air. Some soldiers froze to death before help could reach them, but still, the battle went on. In early January, Patton's Third Army struck north toward Houffalize, linking up with forces advancing from the north. It was a slow, grinding fight, every village a fortress, every bridge a trap. But the momentum had shifted for good. The Allied counteroffensive pressed the Germans back toward their starting positions. The Bulge was shrinking day by day. By January 16th, the jaws of the Allied advance closed. Patton's and Montgomery's forces met near Houffalize, effectively cutting off what remained of the German spearhead. The Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive in the West, was over. The final tally was staggering. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and guns were destroyed or abandoned. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, had bled itself dry. For the Allies, victory came at a terrible price. More than 75,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in the battle. Entire companies had been wiped out, their names etched forever into regimental history. The towns and villages of the Ardennes were left in ruins. Thousands of Belgian and Luxembourg civilians were dead or homeless. What had once been a peaceful winter countryside was now a scarred wasteland. Yet, amid the devastation, the human spirit endured. Survivors of Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge would remember the faces of their comrades, the crack of frozen branches underfoot, the eerie silence after bombardments. Many would speak of the courage they saw in ordinary men. Truck drivers who turned into gunners, cooks who carried ammunition, medics who braved shellfire to reach the wounded. It was, in every sense, a battle of endurance. And endurance had won. After the Ardennes, Germany would never recover. Its armies in the west were shattered, its reserves gone. The Eastern Front collapsed soon after, as Soviet forces surged toward Berlin. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allies had turned into his final strategic failure. Within 4 months, he would be dead in his bunker, and the war in Europe would be over. But for those who had fought in the snow, the young Americans, the weary British, even the retreating Germans, the memories of the Ardennes would remain forever. They remembered the endless nights under bombardment, the way the snow glowed red from explosions, the long marches through ice and fear. They remembered the comrades who never returned, buried beneath the frozen ground. And they remembered what it meant to endure, not for glory, not for victory, but simply to survive. When the guns finally fell silent in late January, the Ardennes returned to its uneasy quiet. The snow covered the wreckage, the bodies, the broken trees. The forests stood still again, as they had before the storm. In that silence, the men who walked away knew they had witnessed something few could truly understand. The last, furious gasp of a dying empire, and the proof that freedom, though costly, could not be crushed by surprise or steel. Today, if you walk through those same forests, through Bastogne, Malmedy, St. Vith, or Houffalize, you can still see the traces of what happened there. Tanks rest as monuments beneath the pines. Names are carved into stone where young men once stood and refused to fall back. The air feels heavy, as if the land itself remembers, and it should. Because in that frozen winter of 1944-45, in the quiet heart of Europe, ordinary men fought one of the most extraordinary battles in history, not for conquest or revenge, but to end the darkness that had engulfed the world. They fought in the snow, in the silence, and in the shadow of death, and they prevailed. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Ardennes forests returned to an uneasy stillness. Snow blanketed the pockmarked roads, shattered villages, and abandoned tanks. Where only weeks before there had been thunder, smoke, and blood, Now there was silence. A silence that carried the weight of loss, exhaustion, and relief. For the soldiers who survived, the end of the fighting did not bring immediate peace. Many had marched for days through ice and snow, carrying wounded comrades, hauling ammunition, and burying the dead. Their hands were blistered, their faces pale, their hearts heavy. Some could not speak of what they had seen. Some would never speak at all. Across the Ardennes, the civilians began to emerge from hiding. They walked carefully through ruined villages, past homes reduced to rubble, past barns burned to the ground. Many had lost family members, friends, or neighbours. Livelihoods were gone, livestock frozen or slaughtered, crops buried beneath the snow. Yet, amid the devastation, life began again. Villagers helped each other rebuild, sharing food, blankets, and shelter. The scars of war were deep, but the resilience of humanity proved deeper. For the Allied armies, the battle left an enduring lesson. It had revealed weaknesses in intelligence and preparedness. The surprise of the German offensive had been possible because the Ardennes was considered quiet, overlooked, and under-defended. Allied commanders realized the importance of vigilance, flexibility, and the ability to respond quickly to unexpected threats. Patton's audacious maneuver and the steadfast defense of Bastogne became models of rapid response and courage under pressure. They showed that leadership, determination, and morale could overcome even the most dire circumstances. For the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophic gamble. It exhausted their last reserves, destroyed countless tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, and cost the lives of tens of thousands of trained soldiers. By the end of January, the Wehrmacht could no longer mount an offensive in the West. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allies, delaying their advance, or negotiating a peace had died in the snow. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the story of the Battle of the Bulge is more than just strategy and numbers. It is a story of human courage, endurance, and defiance. In Bastogne, the soldiers who had faced encirclement and deprivation had refused to surrender. They had stood in freezing cellars under relentless shell fire, with little food and no reinforcements, and they had held, when offered surrender by a vastly superior enemy, a single word, nuts, became a symbol of resistance, bravery, and unyielding resolve. Across the Ardennes, countless acts of similar courage went unrecorded. Truck drivers who became gunners, cooks who carried ammunition, medics who braved the snow to tend the wounded. Their bravery formed the invisible backbone of victory. The battle also left deep psychological scars. Soldiers who survived spoke of the endless nights, the ceaseless shelling, the freezing cold, and the constant fear of sudden death. Many returned home changed, haunted by memories of friends lost in snowdrifts or buried beneath rubble. Some wrote letters that were never sent. Some kept diaries that would later become vital testimonies to the human cost of war. The winter of 1944-45 in the Ardennes became a symbol of endurance under unimaginable hardship. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the price of freedom. Monuments and memorials now stand across the Ardennes, honouring those who fought and died. At Bastogne, the Mardasson Memorial rises as a tribute to the American soldiers who held the town. Names of the fallen are etched into stone. Tanks and artillery pieces remain as silent witnesses to the battles that raged in the frozen forests. Visitors who walk these sites today can imagine the snow-covered ridges, the mud-choked roads, the villages burning in the distance. They can feel the weight of history, a history forged in courage, sacrifice, and relentless determination. The Battle of the Bulge also left a broader legacy. It demonstrated the importance of coalition warfare. Americans, British, Belgians, and other Allied forces working together, coordinating across vast distances and under extreme conditions. It reinforced the value of quick thinking, bold leadership, and adaptability in the face of unexpected threats. In military academies around the world, the Ardennes campaign is studied as a case study in both offensive risk and defensive resilience. The lessons learned there about weather, terrain, intelligence, and morale continue to shape military strategy to this day. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is human. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is a story of ordinary men and women pushed to extraordinary limits. It is a story of fear and bravery, despair and hope, defeat and triumph. It is a story of how, in the heart of winter, in a forest frozen and silent, human courage can shine brighter than any artillery flash, more enduring than any snow-covered ruin. The soldiers of the Ardennes endured frostbite, hunger, fear, and relentless enemy fire. They endured the cold and the chaos and the endless nights, and they endured for something larger than themselves, the defense of freedom, the hope for a world without tyranny. As we look back today, the Battle of the Bulge stands as a monument to resilience. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit can endure. It reminds us of the cost of war, the value of courage, and the power of determination. The Ardennes forests, once scarred by battle, now stand quiet again, but the echoes of winter 1944-45 remain. In the stones, the memorials, and the memories of those who survived. History remembers the battle not only for its scale or strategic importance, but for the bravery of those who refused to yield. It is a story of men and women who faced the storm, the bullets, and the snow, and in doing so, changed the course of history. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a battle. It was a trial of endurance. It was a testament to the courage of soldiers, the resilience of civilians, and the enduring cost of freedom. It was a chapter of war written in snow and blood, remembered for the courage, sacrifice, and spirit of those who survived. And it will never be forgotten.